Falcon, as a rival to them, wants everything to live, everything to survive. He says he will keep on winning to prevent bad, that is death, what Deathborn represents, to thrive. So in some sense, he wants eternal life. Who does he want it for? Well, for everyone, including himself, of course. He is a typical hero. He saves people in danger. So again, I argue that his main goal is to perpetuate life. What he doesn't want is death. The other thing he doesn't seem to want, as well as other heroic F-Zero pilots, is embarrassment in the eyes of others. Embarrassment involving the expression of traits that are not seen as masculine by the audience. This is something he does not want, just as he does not want death. I think this is why Deathborn and Black Shadow are not afraid of their behavior being a projection. In both movies, they don't seem to identify with the role they're playing, because they are aware it's a role. Whenever that role breaks down, due to bloopers or them being aware that it's an ideal they're interpreting, they just adapt to the new role that has resulted from the breakdown of the previous one. For Falcon and the others, however, the breakdown of their role is a catastrophe. It is death, since they are identified completely with that role. The death of the role is the death of themselves, and so they try to make that role survive as much as they can. This often involves technological extensions of the body, to allow the role to be performed even when their bodies are not able to. So Zoda creates a robot to embody masculinity for him. Digiboy uses tech to beat his rivals and be a real man, etc. I think that's why babies are protected by Falcon and the others, because children represent something vulnerable and alive that needs protecting. Youth. Both the robot children and the flesh and bones children seem to be things of value for the pilots, and I'd claim it's because they both represent the extension of life. In this case, the life of the role they're playing. But this masculine role, the behavior that does things, is a role all living beings perform. So trying to be an embodiment of doing, identifying with doing, is doomed to failure, because doing always has further things to do. You will never be doing, because doing can't do be. The failure of the characters then gets presented as either the result of accidental circumstances or their own failings. They need to believe the failure is not due to the impossibility of the task, because the task is what they identify with. Realizing the impossibility of the task would be equal to dying. So the ego's continued survival benefits from structures that will prevent it from realizing the impossibility of realizing an ideal. One way these videos do this is, again, by believing that men can't be men just because of accidents, blunders, etc. So that the ideal can be realized, it's just that it's not being realized. On the other hand, it believes there are people, the beings it doesn't identify with, who already are the embodiment of an ideal, exist in a pure state where there is nothing left to do. These people are, in these videos, those who are identified with the female gender. Jodie Summer, Kate Allen, and Princia Ramode have no goals to reach. They just float around, dance, exist as beings who need nothing to be perfected. Mrs. Arrow and Lily Flyer have goals to reach, but they reach them. The ideal is shown to be perfected. Of course, all people, regardless of whether we call them men or women, have both of these traits. They do things, and they are. They have to make an effort to do things. It's a conscious will. However, we don't have to consciously exert ourselves to be. We just are. It's non-conscious. So the ego, our consciousness, is inherently a doer. So a situation where we tell ourselves that there are people called men who represent the ego and people called women who represent the unconscious is a situation doomed to cause suffering on us, since all people do consciously and exist unconsciously. In this setup, whenever a woman predominantly does things, which, as all people do, will happen, she will be considered dead, since her living identity is based on the act of being. The same will happen to men if they receive whatever circumstances they're in and don't strive for a goal. Suffering is implied in such a situation, but such a situation will survive as long as this suffering isn't directed at it. And the situation these characters are in is such a situation. One where individuals blame themselves and random chance for base impossibility. The male characters need to do and never stop doing, but their bodies have limits. So extensions of the body, technology, fulfill the role of pursuing further goals. Technology here is more than once represented by screen technology. Baba uses the screen to falsely attain goals his body can't attain. John Tanaka's fantasy is represented by a film reel, Digiboy. Several cases, without explicitly pointing to the screen, rely on the idea of screens and projected images, such as Biorex, Beastman, Silver Nielsen, of course, as I have mentioned, Deathborn and Black Shadow. But then we have Drac, who in my mind weirdly pulls this all together. Drac's fantasy of reaching goals is fulfilled thanks to the screen, and specifically a video game. The video game we, the player, are engaged with, F-Zero itself. Digiboy weirdly makes reference to this since his screens are part of his racing machine. Roger Buster, Drac's friend, gets lost in a fantasy of speed and goal reaching, but without a screen, just with the technology of huge vehicles. F-Zero, truly, the game all these pilots share in, is a technological way of reaching goals, ever more dangerous. As pointed to in the last lap of this analysis, F-Zero itself, as a business, depends on ever more difficult goals to attain, more difficult challenges to tackle, all of which can't be done with human bodies alone, but requires technological modification. Be it the use of a huge racing car, technological modifications of the body, or both, which many of the drivers engage in. And of course, F-Zero is a game we, the player, are playing. This goal, ever more difficult and ever more distant, which the racers want to reach, is the goal their life depends on. Their identity, their life, is based around doing more and more things you couldn't do before. Deathborn then, who doesn't identify with life, and Black Shadow, who learns to not identify with it thanks to Deathborn's friendly pats on the shoulder whenever his role breaks down, are the two who seem to recognize that the role of doing is just a role, and not a life identity. But they realize this precisely within the context of, and thanks to, screen technology. They see that it's just a movie, a role. I think what they point to is that the technological extensions of the masculine role are precisely what might help us to see this role as a role. Maybe because seeing it projected on a screen, as we do as we play the video game, might make it more apparent that we can behave as Falcon, or we can behave as Prince Yeromode. We can behave as any of these characters because they are on a screen we can identify with. It allows us to see the impossibility of being just one character. Funnily enough, since the ego seems to identify Deathborn and Black Shadow as representatives of the ego's own death, it represents them as ultra-masculine characters, scarier and more power-hungry than any of the others. As if to distract from the fact that their existence and devotion for death threatens the very role they're portraying.